Man dies during surgery and is shown the heavenly city, near-death experience. First of all, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This real story was sent by a subscriber, and it might completely change the way you see life and death. On that hot, muggy morning in Ventura, California, Mike arrived at the community hospital with a high fever, shaking like he'd been thrown into a freezer. The thermometer read 104 degrees. He looked seriously ill, cold sweats, struggling to breathe. The medical team was doing everything they could to stabilize him before surgery. It was serious, a real risk. But in the middle of all that tension, what was really breaking his heart was saying goodbye to his wife. She was right there, holding his hand with a quiet strength, like she never wanted to let go. "Everything's gonna be fine, babe," she said, eyes filled with tears, trying to sound strong. Mike didn't answer. He just looked into her eyes and nodded, like saying, "I know." But inside, something in him was already slipping away. As soon as he entered the operating room, the cold got worse. But it wasn't just physical. It was like something invisible had changed in the air. Suddenly, everything stopped. The sounds, the lights, the doctors talking. It all disappeared. Like someone had unplugged reality. Total silence, and that's when he saw it. To his right, standing next to the stretcher, was Jesus. It wasn't some vague image. It wasn't imagination. Mike knew what a hallucination felt like. This wasn't that. It was way too real. Jesus had brown skin like a man from the Middle East. His hair was brown, slightly wavy, falling to his shoulders. And his eyes, they were deep. A mix of green and blue, so intense they seemed to see through every hidden thought. But the most striking thing wasn't how he looked. It was what came from him. Love. A love so strong, so absolute, that Mike felt his whole body tremble. Not from fear, but from something he'd never felt before. Completeness. At that moment, a flood of sensations rushed through him. Everything felt more vivid, more clear, more real. The color of the room, the feel of the hospital gown on his skin, his breathing, his sense of time. Everything was heightened. Like everyday reality was just a veil, and now he was seeing what had always been behind it. It was strange because he could still feel his body. He was still on the stretcher. But at the same time, everything was different. Like his consciousness had been taken to another level. That's when the question started creeping in. Did I die? But there wasn't that classic scene of floating above his body. He didn't see himself down there or walk through some tunnel of light like people always describe. It was just him, right there, present, in a place that felt more real than anything he'd ever lived, and that confusion left him speechless. He didn't know what to think. He just knew something huge was starting, and that he wasn't in control anymore. Jesus didn't say anything right away. He just stood there beside the stretcher looking at Mike with a calm expression. There was no rush, no judgment, just presence. A presence so full of love that words felt almost unnecessary. Then, he reached out his hand. Mike hesitated for a second. It was all still unbelievable. But something inside him, maybe his spirit, responded before his mind did. He reached out too. The exact moment their fingers touched, a deep peace washed over his body, like a warm current flowing through, his chest melting away every fear, every question, and that's when Jesus spoke. His voice was firm but gentle, full of a kind authority. "I want to answer your prayer." Mike frowned, confused. Prayer? What prayer? He thought. For a moment, he didn't get it. He couldn't remember praying recently. Nothing specific. But as Jesus kept holding his hand, an old memory surfaced, like a forgotten film from the back of his mind. He was about 8 or 9 years old. in his room, alone, kneeling next to his bed. Just a kid, but that night he had prayed with all his heart. God, can I see heaven one day? I just want to see what heaven looks like. He had completely forgotten about that. Decades had passed. Life went on, busy, filled with work, family, bills, routine. But that prayer, God hadn't forgotten. And now, standing before him, hand in hand with Jesus, Mike understood that prayer was being answered right now. And what came next, there was no way to be ready for it. The moment Jesus gently squeezed Mike's hand, everything changed again. No warning, no sound, no sudden movement. Just a soft feeling of being pulled from within without the body actually moving. In the blink of an eye, Mike was no longer in the operating room. He found himself standing barefoot on top of a white hill. The weirdest part? He was still wearing his hospital gown, that thin surgical robe, but now there were no wires, no needles, nothing attached to his body. And even with the light fabric, he didn't feel cold, or hot, or uncomfortable. His body felt clean, whole, perfect. He looked around, trying to understand where he was. It felt like a place completely outside of Earth, yet somehow more familiar than anywhere he'd ever been. Like that hill had already been part of him before he was even born. There was no pain, no weight, just a peace that can't be explained, and the certainty that something incredible was about to be revealed. And this was just the beginning. Mike started walking slowly, his feet touching the surface of that white hill. At first, it seemed like everything around him was made of light, a light so intense that anywhere else it would have been unbearable. But here, it didn't hurt. On the contrary, it lit up everything with a soft, almost magical glow. Beneath his feet, the grass wasn't like Earth's grass. It had a deep blue-green color like it was alive. And the most surprising thing, he could feel each blade. It was like his feet were touching something sacred, not just in texture, but in the energy it gave off. He stopped for a moment, bent down, and ran his hand through the grass. It wasn't just beautiful, it was perfect, flawless. Every single blade looked like it had been handcrafted one by one, and in that touch, something inside him broke. Because it wasn't just the place that was perfect. He was too. There was. No more pain, no fear, no worries, no anxious thoughts, no heavy memories. He felt whole, complete, fulfilled. Like he had finally arrived at the place he always belonged to, but never knew where it was. And in that absolute silence, everything was speaking to him, as if heaven had its own language, and without realizing it, he was already beginning to understand it. Mike kept walking slowly across that surreal hill, still in silence. The ground seemed to pulse with living, energy, and the air. The air was different, denser, purer, like it was made of something more than just oxygen. That's when he saw it. In the white sky above, beams of light started to appear. They didn't come from the sun. Actually, there was no visible sun, but from a distant glowing point, almost like space itself was sending them out. These beams seemed alive. They weren't just flashes of light. They moved gently, floating, through the air like they knew exactly where they were going. They had the brightness of fluorescent lights, but with a beauty that was infinitely purer. It was hard to describe. One of them came straight toward him. Mike didn't run, didn't flinch. He just stood there, watching, unsure of what was about to happen. The beam touched him right in the center of his forehead. Right then, he felt warmth. But it wasn't physical. It was something deeper. A comforting warmth that spread through his head, chest, his whole body. Like he was being healed from the inside out, not just in body, but in soul. He closed his eyes for a moment and let it happen. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to go back. Still feeling the warmth of the beam flowing through him, Mike opened his eyes. That's when something in front of him started to move. Like a curtain made of light, a kind of white veil began to part, slowly sliding aside. It wasn't normal fabric, it was like it was made of God's own presence. And as it moved away, it revealed what had been hidden behind it. Mike held his breath. There, in the valley below the hill where he stood, a city appeared. But it wasn't any ordinary city. It looked like a place that could only exist in the Creator's mind. Massive, majestic, surrounded by a soft golden mist. The shapes were smooth, yet powerful. Like every detail had been sculpted with perfect precision, on purpose. Towers rose into the air with glowing domes. Some looked like churches, others like palaces. But all of them gave off a sense of holiness, like they weren't just meant to be lived in, but to worship. And the most surprising thing, the city felt alive. Not in a physical way, but as if it had awareness. Like every wall, every street, every point of light knew he was there. Mike felt a chill run through his whole body, because deep down he knew he was looking at heaven. Mike couldn't take his eyes off it. The city in front of him was wrapped in a soft mist that didn't hide anything. It just let him see only what he needed to. Like heaven was saying, it's not time to see everything yet. There was an intentional mystery to it, and that only made it even more fascinating. The golden domes reflected the ambient light in a supernatural way, shimmering with colors he had never seen before. The architecture reminded him of ancient churches, yes, but none of them were like anything built on Earth. It was like the beauty of the world had been combined, then elevated to the highest level of perfection. He saw paths that looked like they were floating in the air, towers built with impossible lightness, and massive arches that opened like portals. There was no dirt, no wear, no sign of time. Everything there was eternal, and even from far away, Mike felt a deep connection to that place. It was like the city knew he was there, like it had been waiting for him. But why? That question hung in the air, echoing inside him as the city stayed silent, mysterious, and breathtakingly beautiful. Mike took a few more steps, completely mesmerized by what he was seeing. But then, something behind the city caught his attention. He turned his head, and there it was. A massive mountain, covered in absolutely perfect pine trees. Each tree looked like it had been placed with intention, like divine brushstrokes on a living work of art. The trunks, straight and strong. The canopies, symmetrical, not a single leaf out of place. No dead branches, no flaws. And the sky. The sky was putting on a show. The sunset wasn't like anything on Earth. It was as if all the colors of the universe had been thrown onto the horizon and were dancing together. Deep orange, turquoise blue, intense purple, emerald green, all blending in slow motion like the colors themselves had a soul. It was impossible to tell where the light was coming from, since there was no visible sun. But it was there, and it kept changing the landscape constantly, like the sky was painting its own scene in real time, just for him. Mike felt like he was inside a painting, and at the same time, part of the brush. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to lock the image in his memory, but deep down, he already knew that image would never leave him. As he was still gazing at that heavenly sunset, something caught his eye above the trees. A new beam of light, more intense than the others, slowly descended from the sky, coming from that same glowing point that seemed to be watching everything. It came down in absolute silence, but carried a vibrant energy, like a whisper from the Creator himself. The beam touched the top of one of the pine trees, and then it exploded. But it wasn't an explosion of destruction. It was pure beauty. The beam broke into thousands of tiny points of light, flying in every direction like living particles. They looked like moving diamonds, each with its own glow and color. They spread through the air like celestial fireworks, but without sound, only presence. Mike stood frozen. There were no words to describe what he felt. It wasn't just beautiful. It was sacred. Each point of light seemed to carry a secret, a message, an essence. And for a moment, he felt like every single particle knew his name. There were no words, but there was understanding, and he knew. This wasn't a show to entertain. It was a glimpse of glory. Mike was still in awe of the silent dance of those lights in the sky when he felt his presence again, right there beside him, as if he had never left. Jesus stepped closer, and with the same calmness as before, spoke, with a voice that seemed to touch not just the ears, but the entire soul. "It is the glory of the Lord." Just those words. But they were enough. In that moment, Mike couldn't hold himself up. The weight of it was so great, so real, that he dropped to his knees right there on that heavenly hill. But it wasn't a weight that hurt. It was the weight of truth, of revelation, of meaning. It was like, for the first time, he understood the word glory, not as a distant concept, but as something alive, tangible all around him. The lights still danced in the sky, but now they seemed to respond to that phrase, as if everything, the trees, the wind, the sky, the grass, the beams, was in worship. Mike said nothing. He didn't need to. His body trembled, his eyes filled with tears, and in that exact moment, he vanished from there. Back on Earth, a jolt of electricity shot through his chest, and his eyes opened. The light was different now, cold, artificial. And there were voices, movement, activity. Mike opened his eyes with difficulty, like someone waking up from a deep dive. Still struggling to breathe, his blurry vision started to clear, and the face of a doctor appeared above him, breathing hard, gloves still smeared with adrenaline. "What's your name?" the doctor asked urgently. Mike blinked a few times, confused, trying to gather his thoughts. "Mike," the doctor paused. "Where are you?" There was a brief silence. Mike looked around, still trying to understand why he was lying down, why everything felt so strange, why the sky was gone. And then he answered, "Ventura." The word came out almost as a whisper, not because he didn't know, but because for a second it felt wrong, like he had returned to a place that no longer felt like home. Earth now seemed smaller, and he knew, deep inside, that something unbelievable had happened. While he was still trying to figure out where he was, and why his body felt so heavy, like he had been forcefully pulled back, Mike's eyes caught something beside the stretcher. It was the crash cart. The electrodes were hanging loose, still stuck to parts of his chest. One of the wires dangled, and a nurse was quickly gathering the equipment, still visibly shaken. That's when it hit him. He wasn't just groggy from anesthesia. He had died. The shock he felt in his chest, the one that brought him back at the exact moment he knelt before the glory in heaven, was real. A resuscitation shock. He had crossed the line. For how long, he couldn't say. But he had been on the other side. And now, lying there, still unable to fully move his body, Mike realized nothing would ever be the same again. Not long after, in the recovery room, still surrounded by machines and monitors, the lead surgeon entered. His eyes were sunken, his face serious, and he clutched the clipboard tightly, like he was still trying to process what had just happened. He stopped beside the bed, looked Mike in the eye, and said bluntly, "You should be dead." Mike said nothing. The doctor's words weren't cold, they were full of disbelief. He took a deep breath and added, "It was the worst case I've ever seen, where the patient survived." That confirmed everything Mike already knew inside. It wasn't just a scare, not a blackout. He had really died, and what he experienced was far more than just physical collapse. It was a visit to the other side, and now that he was back, the thing that hurt the most wasn't his body. It was the weight of what he had seen, and the struggle of explaining it to people who had never been there. Over the next 3 days, Mike tried. He really tried. to tell his wife what had happened. But every time he opened his mouth, the words got stuck in his throat. He'd start to speak, try to describe it, but just thinking about Jesus' eyes, the city, that indescribable peace. The tears would come. He cried silently, not from sadness, but from something that had no name. His wife sat beside the bed, held his hand, waited patiently. Sometimes all he could say was, "I went somewhere," and she'd squeeze his hand tighter, like she understood, even without hearing the details. It was hard. How do you describe something that doesn't belong to this world? How do you explain that heaven is real when you don't even know where to begin? So he stayed quiet, not out of shame, but because it was all still settling inside him. It was like his soul was still slowly coming back. Before all of this, Mike was what many would call a Sunday Christian. He went to church, knew the stories, said he believed, but lived on autopilot. God was just an idea. Heaven, a distant concept. Jesus? A sacred figure maybe, but still far away, untouchable. After the experience, everything turned upside down. Jesus wasn't a stained glass image anymore, or a childhood memory. He was real now. Mike had seen him, had felt his hand, heard his voice. They were there, together. And heaven. It was no longer a vague hope. It was a real place, alive, timeless, far more real than anything human eyes could ever see. His faith wasn't just theory anymore. It became memory, and that changed everything. The way he prayed, the way he saw people, the way he viewed his own existence, he knew deep down he could never go back to being the man he once was, because once you touch the eternal, the ordinary never tastes the same again. The days that followed his discharge weren't just about physical recovery. Mike was carrying something much heavier, and at the same time, much lighter, than any scar. Heaven inside him. It might sound like an exaggeration, but it wasn't. He came home with new eyes, literally. Every simple thing in daily life started to gain meaning he had never noticed before. Like on the 6th day, when he was finally allowed to eat solid food after days of just liquids, they gave him a banana. Just that. But when he took the first bite, he broke down. He cried like a child. Not because of the banana itself, but because of the perfection of creation. The sweetness, the texture, the miracle of something so simple holding so much life. It was just a fruit. But in that moment, it was a clear reminder from God saying, "I'm in everything." And from that day on, everything became a message. Flowers on the sidewalk, the smell of coffee, the sky at dusk, the breeze on his face, everything spoke to him. Mike started taking pictures of the flowers in his yard, of the birds on the fence, of details no one else seemed to notice. And it wasn't about artistic beauty. It was about seeing God hidden in the small gestures of everyday life. Life, once so fast-paced, became a conscious walk. He used to be buried in work, pressure, rush, and family responsibilities. But at the hospital, walking the halls and looking at the framed landscapes on the walls, he realized he'd always been running, without really living. He began to slow down, to live more present, to feel more, to talk less, to love with more intention. Jesus didn't give him a specific mission. No to-do list, no audible calling, but inside something pulsed. Share, tell, love. And that's what he began to do. He told his story to anyone willing to listen, not to convince, but to testify. Because he knew there are many people silently asking to see God, to feel heaven, to understand that life doesn't end here. Mike had prayed that when he was 9 years old. It took 40 years for the answer to come, but it came. And if he learned anything from that, it's that God's timing doesn't follow a clock. But when he answers, everything changes. Today, Mike no longer fears death because he's already seen what comes after, and he understands that he's still here for a reason. 13 grandchildren have been born since that day. 13 lives that wouldn't exist if he hadn't come back. And for him, that alone would be reason enough to have been spared. But he believes the purpose goes beyond that. It's about reminding people that God is here, now, in the details, in the silence, in the perfect timing. And maybe, just maybe, this story reached you for that very reason. God bless you and your family.